What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to the vlog. This is the episode for Friday, September the 17th, 2021. And if you're a Canon photographer, the big news this week has been the EOS R3, the formal announcement of the EOS R3. And that is the topic that I'm talking about today. Now, I don't have a couple of disclaimers, I guess. I don't have any inside information on this. I'm not a Canon ambassador. I'm not a Canon explorer of light. I'm not a reviewer of sufficient stature that I don't even know if Canon gives reviewers pre-release or pre-advanced copies of cameras anymore. I don't have any particularly great or particularly special access or any special access to anybody at Canon to get information about unreleased cameras. I'm working off of what Canon has publicly disclosed about the R3 or publicly released on the R3. Additionally, I haven't watched or seen everything that they have officially released. They've put out a ton of videos. Videos are hard to parse, I understand. I make them. Videos are hard to parse if you're just skimming through to get information compared to a data sheet or text. So I have read some third-party discussions, for example, those by Brian over at the Digital Picture. There are some claims and assertions in those discussions that I can't find substantiating information for, and I'm not saying they're wrong. It's entirely possible that some of the things that Brian has said in his preview discussion, whatever you want to call it, is information that he has gotten from contacts at Canon or explorers of light or other people who have specifically given him information that just isn't in the general sphere of the web. Additionally, I feel a little weird kind of talking about the R3 in that I have no intention of buying one. So when I talked about the R5, I was very much coming at it as the perspective of, going back to when it was announced, I was very much coming at it from the perspective of someone who fully intended to buy the camera, was part of the target market, was pretty much intending to buy the camera, and was very much interested in what was coming out ahead of time because of that. With the R3, I'm not the target market, and I'm not really intending to buy the camera unless some serious changes happen in my circumstances and what I shoot and whatnot that puts me into that target market. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of a disinterested Canon user. I'd like to see it be successful. I'm not overly concerned one way or another. I don't think Canon's going to go away if it does poorly. I don't think it's going to do that bad. I don't think Canon's going to go out of business if it's not a stellar success. Likewise, I don't think they're going to become global dominating, whatever, puts everybody else out of business if it is. So with that said, these are the things that I have seen in the specs and the press release, press information, everything that's been put out on the camera so far that I found interesting, and kind of why I found them interesting, and what maybe insights we can glean about what's going on with the technology or the engineering or what's going on sort of with Canon in Canon. So the first thing I noticed that was quite interesting was the ISO range. The stock or base ISO range on the camera is 100,000 or 100 to 100,000. And it expands one stop above and below that, so the total expanded ISO range is 50 to 200,000. And that's, I thought, an interesting range because, for example, the 1DX Mark III goes all the way to ISO 800,000, so two stops higher end expanded range. And honestly, this is a smaller expanded range than what I was expecting Canon to have in the camera. I figured, it should have pretty good ISO performance because it's got a fairly low resolution sensor, so it should be good for collecting a lot of light. And the image quality, there shouldn't be a huge amount of reasons that Canon shouldn't be able to have pushed the ISO up higher. Now, the flip side to that discussion is that the ISO ranges on professional cameras, the 1Ds, the D3 or D5s, the A whatevers, A9s, A1s, there's certainly a level, at least between Canon and Nikon, where I have felt that they have been pushing ISO range numbers as if it was purely, or I won't say purely, but partly marketing driven. I certainly feel this way with respect to the Nikon D5 when they put in ISO 3.2 million, and the pictures are almost unusable in my experience. The same thing goes with the ISO 1.6 million and the D500. Pictures are you couldn't tell. You could almost tell everything is Sasquatch or a Loch Ness monster, and it doesn't really matter because the pictures are basically that bad. With Canon, they've been more reserved. So the 1DXs only went up to 800,000. That's not, I mean, it's still high, but it's not quite pushing those kind of just purely marketing based limits. The question that I have to ask is, how useful is that thing? How important is it really there as a photographer? Now, again, I'm not a photojournalist, so there's a level where I can't specifically speak to their specific needs. But from my shooting, because my R5 can do ISO 100,000 and my 5D Mark IVs can do ISO 100,000, and from my experience shooting with those cameras in all kinds of situations and just generally trying to see how they performed at the high ISO settings, I've struggled to find really useful or high, really useful limits to where I needed that. I've certainly found tons of situations where I'd shoot at 6400 or 12,800, but when you started getting to 100,000, it was not it wasn't especially something that I found useful to me. Now, obviously, there's a train of thought in so many people who are commenting about stuff on cameras or related to cameras on the internet who can't articulate a good justification for why they need more or want more, but want more. More resolution, higher ISOs, more frame rates, faster this, faster that, faster the next thing, more. And if you can't deliver it, you don't know what you're doing as engineers or a camera company. And I've never been able to find really good articulation from these people as to where the limit actually was, or whether they thought there was even a limit, or whether they even use these things that they're saying more. Because quite honestly, it doesn't matter if the camera goes to ISO 10 million if you never actually use ISO 10 million. Likewise, it doesn't really matter if you have a 50 megapixel camera if you only are ever looking at phone screen sized crops of your images or phone screen sized, images. So on one hand, I'm kind of surprised to see that the ISO range didn't go that much, or didn't go to insane numbers, or at least didn't go to 800,000. On the other hand, I'm not at all unhappy or unsurprised or find it to be unreasonable. I think that by and large, the more reasonable camera companies or the more reasonable product lines are very clearly settling into 100 to 200,000 is the top ISO that the camera really needs to do. And, quite honestly, if you stop at making a sensor that can go up to 200,000, that's effort that can be put into making the sensor do something else better. Remember, engineering, there's a fixed amount of resources that can go into this stuff, and I'd rather see resources go into better dynamic range at low ISOs or better noise performance, which of course, that would allow potentially the ISOs to go higher. But if you're faster readouts, global electronic shutters, there's a lot of things that would be nice to have. And a global electronic shutter would be a really nice thing with no cost in dynamic range. Would be a really nice thing to see, in mirrorless cameras, but that's resources aren't going to that if they're going to just putting seemingly insane ISO numbers or sensors that can put out insane ISO numbers. And then, of course, image quality and performance is another one of those things. If you can't put out the image quality, and this is the complaint that I had with the Nikon D5, it really couldn't put out the image quality at ISO 3.2 million or 1.6 million for that matter. And Nikon's way to get there was to just let the image quality suffer as opposed to actually putting out a good quality, actually maintaining a quality standard that ensured that photographers would get good usable images. So ISO range is lower than I expected. It is a little bit better than the Alpha 1. The Alpha 1 only goes to 102,400 max and fully expanded, so it does go a stop higher than that. But I thought that was an interesting one to consider too, or to see. Is it not going as high as I really expected it to? Of course, as I said, I'm not sure that going super high is really that, much higher than say 200,000 is a really that valuable or important. So second thing that stuck out or I noticed looking at was shutter speeds. Obviously the camera does mechanical, first curtain electronic, and the fully electronic shutter modes. The big selling point or talking point is that the stacked sensor architecture provided the bandwidth to allow the fully electronic shutter to be less rolling shutter artifacts, faster readouts, so higher frame rates, and so on and so forth. What they didn't talk about up to the announcement of the camera that is in the specs is we are now getting some higher shutter speeds. So historically, shutter speeds have always been 1/8,000th a second, 30 seconds, plus bulb. With the R3, we are now getting shutter speeds above an 8,000th of a second. Now, Sony's had this for a while, but for Canon, this is new. So we're getting 1/10,000th, 1/12,800th, 1/12,800th, 1/16,000th, 1/32,000th, and 1/64,000th. And those are, well, the 64,000th is, as far as I know, I think it's a stop faster than what the Alpha 1 can do, what Sony's doing. Obviously, faster shutter speeds allow you to freeze action, although, to be honest, there's certainly a level where I'm not sure that you need to go much further again. Again, there's always going to be the people that say, I want more, and never really can articulate what exactly more, why exactly more is that important. A 64,000th of a second is really fast. So is a 32,000th of a second. So is a 10,000th of a second. That's 100 microseconds by doing the math right. Yeah, that's 100 microseconds. So, we're starting to talk about some really short shutter speeds in the microsecond range, which is certainly impressive. I just don't know how necessary it ultimately is, at least going all the way to the far end of that. What I thought was interesting, one of the things couple things stuck out to me. One thing that stuck out to me is that there are no third stop increments above 1/16,000th of a second. So it's third stops basically past for a one stop range past 1/8,000th. So you have third stops to 1/16,000th, and then it's whole stop increments to 32 and 64, or 1/32,000th, 1/64,000th. And Canon notes in the spec sheet that for auto exposure adjustments that the camera will use the ISO or the aperture instead of the shutter speed. Additionally, Canon notes that for shutter speeds of 1/10,000th of a second and faster, they will only be available in shutter priority and manual. And I guess this makes sense. It seems pretty reasonable. Like the settings are there. You can manually select them, but the camera isn't going to auto exposure into them if you're, say, an aperture priority. Which, like I said, that to me, that seems pretty reasonable. Given how high these shutter speeds are, you're going to need a ton of light to, use them. So there's going to be, there needs to be some thought on the part of the photographer deliberately wanting to use these as opposed to just having the camera switch to it. The other thing I thought very interesting about the electronic shutter is, well, two things actually. First is there's now bulb mode available. So instead of the R5, which was limited to, I think it's a quarter of a second, might be, hang on, let's just look. Half a second. So the R5 is limited to a half a second when fully electronic. This will go all the way to 30 seconds in fully electronic. The R3 will go all the way to full 30 seconds in fully electronic and actually into bulb. So that's a nice step in a forward, nice advancement, I think. What I thought was interesting is the X-Sync speed listed in the data sheet for fully electronic is 1/180th of a second, which is slower than the X-Sync speed for the mechanical shutter, which is a 200th of a second, or the first curtain electronic shutter, which is a 250th of a second. And I'm not sure why that's the case. Like, it seems to me like the X-Sync speed ought to be higher. Now, it's certainly possible it's a typo. I have found at least one typo in the data sheet already. Really sad to see the typos in data sheets or spec sheets from Canon for cameras that are being announced. It's like somebody didn't proofread them. This is a problem with the R5 too. There was typos in the data sheet or spec sheet. But going off of that, I'm surprised that there isn't something faster. It's slower than what the Alpha 1 manages with the fully electronic shutter, and the 250th maximum is slower than what the Sony Alpha 1 manages with the mechanical shutter. The other thing that I think would be interested to see, but then maybe it isn't really relevant because it doesn't affect sort of the user base for these cameras, is shutter speeds longer than a 30th of a second. So I know there's bulb, and I know you can always put the camera in bulb, and there's probably going to be a bulb timer built into the camera like it is on the R5. That's a lot harder to set up than being able to just dial in a couple more, so say if you want a 2-minute exposure when you're shooting neutral density for a landscape, it's way easier to just click the shutter speed a couple of notches and put the camera in bulb, use the bulb timer, or use a TC80N3 external controller or whatever. It seems to me like that's a feature. Nikon has it on their cameras. I think it would be a nice feature to see. And it's math. It's not, even if it was only limited to manual mode or shutter priority to get slower shutter speeds, kind of like the really high shutter speeds are, it's not like the processor can't calculate it. Moving on. So drive modes. Obviously, the big selling point with the camera was that the electronic shutter can do 30 frames a second, and that there is due to the high-speed readout, there is less rolling shutter effect, or very minimal or almost no rolling shutter effect in shooting the electronic shutter at, high frame rates, or shooting with the electronic shutter. One thing they have implemented, according to the data sheet, is at a minimum, there are defined step downs in speed for the electronic shutter, which this was something the R5 doesn't have, and I don't understand why it doesn't have it. But for the R3, if you're shooting an electronic shutter in continuous high plus, you're shooting at 30 frames a second. In continuous high, you're shooting at 15 frames a second, and in low, you're shooting at 3 frames a second. On the R5, it's 20 frames a second, regardless of what continuous mode you're shooting in, and I find that frustrating. This is a way better way to do it. I don't understand why they couldn't do that with the R5, because obviously they could slow the frame time or readout rate, or not the readout, but slow the frame interval throw frames away and just, dump the data, even if they didn't want to, even if they couldn't read the sensor slower, which they can, but dump, every other frame or something, and give us 10 frames a second, and dump every third frame and give us 5 or whatever that would work out to be, 6.5. I don't know. I'm not, whatever that math works out to be. Hopefully the 1D or the R3 will continue the 1DX series line of allowing you to tune the shutter speeds, or not shutter speeds, frame rates. So that's the other problem with the R3, is you can't turn 20 frames a second down. Maybe you don't need it. Like, shooting at 20 or 30 frames a second for full resolution generates a lot of information. If you don't need all of those images, all you're doing is filling up a card, or you don't need that frame rate for whatever you're shooting. All you're doing is filling up a card with images that you're going to ultimately have to deal with, both the cognitive load of editing that down and the storage load of, storing them until you delete them. So, but it's it's a plus that they've definitely got the electronic shutter doing doing steps. And there's another thing, I guess I'll mention it real quick, but the mechanical and first curtain electronic shutter are pretty much the same performance as the R5. Might even be the same mechanical shutter. I would assume it's going to be higher performance, it's going to be rated higher or something like that in terms of MTBF, but the actual frame rates are the same as the R5, which I will come back to at the end of this video. So moving on, the next thing is video. Everybody wants to know about video, it seems, these days. Well, of course, this is on YouTube. It's a video. It's almost like people forgot that still photography is still something that is relevant and that people still do. And so there's some video stuff for the R6. Obviously, it does video. It's not going to not do video. Far as I can tell, or based on the specs, there's three resolutions that it's shooting in. So it'll do full 6K for the sensor, 4K, and full HD, which is 1080p. In 6K mode, you can shoot 24 to 60 frames a second, so pretty good frame rates there. What's interesting to me is that there's RAW only listed in the manual. The manual does not list a compressed or a lossy compressed, so AVC or HEVC compressed video when shooting in 6K. Because it's RAW, it's 12 bits. That's what Canon does for their mirrorless camera RAW, or their RAW files for the mirrorless cameras. Interesting question on this whole thing is when shooting with the electronic shutter. So on the EOS R5, when you shoot with the electronic shutter in still mode, you drop the 12 bits because essentially the camera is doing video at 20 frames a second, but for the whole sensor. And instead of stuffing the things in the output into a video file, it's stuffing the output into single raw still files, but so you've got a reduced bit depth. The question that I ask here, which is not obvious or clear, and I have not seen anything in the data sheet that says anything about this, is when shooting with the electronic shutter on the R3 for stills, presumably the same kind of thing as what the EOS R5 is doing is going to be happening. So it's basically going to be shooting video for the full sensor area, and instead of compressing it and stuffing it into a video file, it's stuffing it into a raw file as a still image. So the question that I haven't seen is whether the camera will be shooting at lower bit rates for both the high speed plus in mechanical and first curtain electronic mode, and at full electronic shutter, because of basically how it's happening. And it's entirely possible that it won't. It's not a given that it has to be that way because the R5 was that way. It's just something that's there. Now, On the non-raw, not having available raw or non-raw modes for shooting at 6K. This is also a thing that's a case on the 1DX Mark III. It doesn't have non-raw modes, as far as I know, for the full sensor width or full sensor resolution readout. It only does raw. On the other hand, the R5 does do AVC, HEVC, whatever you want to call it, IPV and all I compression is available when shooting in 8K. So you can shoot 8K and generate relatively small files. They're still huge, but you can definitely shoot 8K IPB to an SD card on an R5 and, deal with it, get along with it. So, the other video modes are 4K, obviously. 4K, the camera supports 24 to 120 frames per second, so that's not bad. It has basically 3 compression modes that are available. So if HDR-PQ or Canon log is off, it will shoot 8-bit 422 or 420 AVC compressed data. If you set HDR-PQ or Canon log on, it jumps to 10-bit and uses HEVC instead of AVC, and also goes to 422 chroma subsampling. So better image quality, etc., better chroma subsampling. The cost of file size, the cost of some potential file size or whatever. But then again, that's made up by using the more efficient compression of HEVC instead of AVC. Full HD does the same shoot and match as 4K, so 24 to 120 frames per second. Same compression setup or same compression settings as 4K mode, so 8-bit 420 AVC for not having anything fancy turned on. HDR-PQ or Canon log 10-bit HEVC 422 is on for that. Clip length limits. So this is one of the places where I'm not entirely sure what the situation is. Brian at the Digital Picture is reporting that the recording time limits have been removed. The data sheet or the spec sheet that you can download from Canon for the R3 says, quote, movie recording is interrupted if the maximum recording time per movie is reached. Now, this is almost the exact same as what is in the 1DX Mark III manual, except the part where it says 29 minutes and 59 seconds has been removed. So I'm not sure what this is supposed to mean. Certainly that this could mean that the recording limits have been removed. It could also mean, and that this is there because there's still, quote, limits in the sense that, well, if the card gets full, then the movie recording is obviously going to be interrupted and stop. If the camera overheats, the movie recording is also going to stop. But what else? What is exactly does this maximum recording time per movie mean? Like, if there are no clip length limits, then why even have this line as an asterisk in the manual? Of course, the other possibility is that there's a user configurable clip length limit where you can set the camera to just record for n minutes, which actually would be kind of a neat feature in some respects, because there's certainly places where you might want to have a camera, you might want the camera to record video, and you might be triggering it remotely or something, and you know that it needs to record video for 35 minutes or 2 hours or whatever, and then at the end of that, it should stop. I'm thinking, for example, if you were putting a 6K 60 frame per second camera out for a rocket launch in a remote, you're triggering the remote's triggered generally from using sound triggers. So when still shooters, basically there's a sound trigger that closes the contacts that causes the camera to start shooting. That same trigger could easily be used to start the camera recording video. So the rocket lights off, the sound happens, the camera starts shooting stills, in the normal sense, or starts shooting video. Now, Rocket launches, when they light the it's in the camera for not even 30 seconds, I think, depending on, of course, the angle of view of your camera. So if you're shooting 6K video, you're going to want a record limit, maybe 2 minutes at most, because you absolutely don't need the camera to remote trigger. And bear in mind, the reason I'm talking about like remotes for car racing, any of the places that our remote cameras get put for still photography. In the case of, for example, remotes at rocket launches from, say, NASA, those remotes have to be put out at least 24 hours, is my understanding, if not more, in advance of when the rocket launch happens, and they are not picked up until the range is safe or the pad's safe, which could be several hours after the rocket happens. And editing, it's a huge issue if what you're doing is getting, you're shooting 2 hours, you put a big card in and you end up with 2 hours of 6K video, and all you needed was the first 30 seconds. You have to now cut that somehow, reprocess it. So it is possible, and it would certainly be a valuable feature that I could see, to have a factory configurable record time, or not a factory, a user configurable record time limit that would allow you to basically put one of these cameras in a position the way you would put a remote camera for still photography, except shooting video. And 6K video is pretty good resolution. It's I don't see what the resolution actually is. Hand quickly here. 6K videos is a pretty good resolution video, so you can extract stills, and it's raw, so you could extract stills from that and use those as image submissions, but then you also get your 2 minutes or whatever of 60 frame per second video that also could be used, as a journalistic type thing. So that might be what the situation is. I don't know. I'm completely speculating there, but that seems like it could be a useful feature in this product level, in this market segment. 4K video is nominally oversampled. So it's not entirely clear to me if all 4K video is oversampled, or if there's an oversampled mode, similar to how on the R5 we have high quality 4K and regular quality 4K. So this, again, Canon in the press document, or the documentation for the camera, definitely indicates that 4K content can be shot oversampled. So if you're shooting at DCI 4K, it oversamples from the full 6K frame width of the camera. If you're shooting in UHD, so 16:9 aspect ratio, then it crops the edges off. It's slightly cropped, essentially. That's how Canon does UHD on all of their cameras. Instead of rescaling the vertical, they just pull in the sides a little bit. The crop factor ends up being 1.06x. It's kind of negligible. It's entirely negligible from a performance perspective. That it has this minimal crop. And of course, the flip side is Sony at least doesn't do DCI aspect ratios at all. And if you're doing anything sort of cinematography with it, you're probably shooting the wider aspect ratio for the extra width, because cinematography is going to end up cutting the tops down a little. And if you have a wider width, you cut the top down less to get a cinematic aspect ratio. Now, this is where I'm not sure, because there's nothing I can find that clearly says it. But again, Brian at the Digital Picture is saying that full HD video is oversampled. I can't find any confirmation of that. In fact, it's entirely possible, and my guess is that the camera will both do line skipping and oversampling, because they clearly make notes in the manual in the thermal performance of oversampling versus non-oversampling, which to me indicates that this is going to be an optional thing, kind of like the high quality 4K footage that you can shoot on the R5. So if you have it on, you're getting oversampled data or downsampled data from the full sensor output. If you have it off, it's doing line skipping. With the advantage being that potentially if it's doing line skipping in non-high quality mode or whatever, you're not going to have thermal problems because they're not listing that as an issue. So when it comes to full HD, though, I can't find any information that says it's oversampled or not. Theoretically, it wouldn't be too ridiculously onerous for that to be the case. The hard part computationally of oversampling the video is going from 6K to 4K because it's not even multiple, and so the pixels have to be scaled down. It would be computationally much easier. Well, I mean, it would be computationally the same if you went 6K to 1080p, but it would also be computationally very easy to go from 4K to 1080p as an oversampling process too. So, not real sure about that. It's possible. It's within the realm of possibilities, but it's not something I'm seeing specifically called out by the Canon in the manual. Additionally, the camera only supports C-Log3 when shooting with Canon log. So the R5, for example, supports C-Log2 and 3. I don't know how much of a problem this is actually in practice. C-Log3 is definitely the better log gamma that compared to C-Log2, and practically the only reason you'd shoot C-Log2 on an R5 was to match a Cinema EOS camera that didn't support C-Log3, because you're going to want to shoot log 3. That's what you want for image quality reasons and dynamic range reasons. You want to shoot log 3, not something lower than that. Okay, so that's what the video capabilities are in a nutshell, which brings me to, I mentioned thermal limits, and thermal limits still exist. Now, Canon has done a couple of things with thermal limits on the R5. One is they have added a high temperature and a standard temperature cutoff. So the camera can be allowed to get hotter, essentially. According to the data sheet, for 6K 60 footage, which again, that's a pretty good amount of data, the camera under standard temperature cutoff will get about 25 minutes at room temperature. At high temperature cutoff, it'll get 60 plus minutes. At 4K 120, Canon is saying 12 minutes for standard temperature and 12 minutes for high temperature. At 4K 60, all eye compression, 6K oversampling to get to the 4K, they're saying 60 plus minutes in both standard and high. And for 4K 30 and presumably everything else, they're saying no limit. So 4K 30, all eye oversampled, they're saying that there's no thermal limits imposed by that. So out of the gate, based on the published recording times, they're comparable or better than the Sony A1. So that's a good thing. I'm going to say it's a good thing. What prompts me about this is now we have two Canon cameras with basically comparable capabilities. So we have the R3 and the 1DX Mark III. And one has thermal limits and the other doesn't. And that raises some questions to me about what the actual limitation really is. So obviously I say obviously, but there's essentially two things that impact the camera's performance due to heat. Well, three things potentially. So the first thing is as the sensor gets hotter, thermal noise makes the sensor image or the image noisier. And when I shot a lot of bird photography, I used to actually be able to tell about how warm the day was based on how noisy my images were, because, and this wasn't any kind of magical thing. This was just, if you shoot enough at the same-ish setting, so I usually was shooting at ISO 400, and this was about 10 years ago on a 1D Mark III, you get really familiar with what the images should look like. And so I was very familiar with basically how noisy the sky would end up being when I was shooting, with the camera. And you could very definitely see, oh, this was a hot morning versus this was a cold morning, or I was in the sun a lot more this morning than that morning, and therefore the camera was much hotter, in the noise in the sky. Same thing applies to this. Same thing applies to video. The hotter the sensor is, the noisier the image becomes. The second potential area of problem is computational errors in the processor. So this shouldn't be a problem, but if you've ever been interested in or tried overclocking your computer, what the procedure essentially is you overclock the computer and then you run a computational intensive program like Prime 95, which calculates Mersenne primes, or LinPack, which is a math processing benchmark. Both of those pieces of software have code in them that detects whether the calculations are erroneous. And so what can happen if you're, for example, again, overclocking your computer, is the thermals can get away to a point where the processor starts making erroneous calculations. And obviously that's not a good thing when your processor making correct calculations is entirely dependent, or the performance of the operation of your computer or camera is entirely dependent on your processor making the correct calculations. So that's possibility number 2. Shouldn't really be a problem, but it is a possibility. The third possibility is a user safety point. So what nobody really considered too much until in the last couple of years, and now you start seeing some warnings and camera manuals and stuff, are what's called low temperature burns. And basically, for not really that high of heat sources, so temperatures in the 40 to 50 centigrade or 40 to 45 centigrade range, which is about 104 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit, extended exposure to that in skin contact basically could cook your tissue. You could almost think about it as sous videing your hand without the vacuum. That's obviously not good. So that is something, again, that camera makers are attempting to provide, or going to be providing protection against, because obviously burning the hands of photographers is not where things want to be. So the second question that comes up is what the actual limiting factors for all of this thermal shutdown stuff is. So as I said, the 1DX Mark III basically has the same bit rates and almost the same resolutions capabilities as the R3 does, but it doesn't have thermal shutdown limits. And I've never actually heard, I mean, it's entirely possible, but I've never actually heard of a 1DX Mark III overheating when shooting video and shutting down. But the 1DX Mark III has some advantages over the R3. So first of all, it doesn't have in-body image stabilization, which sensor image quality performance-wise, image stabilization in IBIS works by moving the sensor. Moving the sensor makes it very hard to attach, say, a heat pipe to the sensor to move heat away from it and off into the camera somewhere. It's just, that's the fact of reality of IBIS. If you want good thermal, transfer away from the sensor, either through a heat pipe or just a heat plate or something like that, that mass makes IBIS harder if you're attaching it to the sensor. So if imagine a little heat sink on the back of the sensor, that's now mass that the cameras, the in-body stabilizer actuators have to overcome, or you just can't have it there. So that's possibly one factor. The other possible factor is, again, of course, the 1DX Mark III is going to be a little bit bigger body than the R3. Looking at some comparative pictures analysis that I've been doing, it's not maybe that much bigger, but a little bit can go a long way when you're talking about some of this stuff. And again, if you've got a heat pipe that's moving the heat away from the sensor to some other part of the camera to dissipate it, that's also, a bigger chassis lift gives you more room to do that and more material to dissipate the heat to. The other difference that I noticed is the card access between the R3 and the 1D Mark III or 1DX3. So both camera or the 1DX Mark III uses two compact CF Express cards, whereas the R3 only uses one. So from a card heat perspective, and CF Express cards are pretty hot when they're, they get pretty hot regardless, even when they're not doing anything. You'd think that the 1DX would have a higher thermal issue because it has two cards instead of one. However, the flip side of that is that on the R3 the cards are inserted similar to how they are on the R5, so they go in from the side, whereas on the 1DX Mark III they go in from the back, and therefore there's more chassis between the cards and the edge of the hand grip, and that might actually make a factor if the cards are the direct sort of, or a direct sort of cause of this. So if the card is getting hot, which is causing the hand grip to get too hot to be safely handleable for long periods of time, that might be the issue. I don't know. This is a really interesting area, I think, that most people gloss over because most people are only concerned about the fact that there's thermal throttling and that's bad, blah, blah, blah. I think the engineering here could be really fascinating to get into, to understand exactly what the limits are and where, and why, why these limits come in, and why, for example, they're not in a camera like the 1DX Mark III. Now, of course, could Canon have done better? Answer is maybe. I mean, the one answer people would give is to say, yes, of course they could do better, but, maybe they can't. If it's something related to cooling the sensor with IBIS, it could be very difficult, if not impossible, to keep a sensor cool when you can't physically, you can't build a heat pipe to get the heat away from the sensor that, easily or effectively, or you compromise the image stabilization. I think the question that would be interesting to ask is, and if you've got some thoughts on this, throw them in the comments below, is what's more important to you in a mirrorless hybrid camera? A sensor that stays cool and gives you unlimited recording times at possibly all of its options. So, we're talking the high-end stuff, so 8K, 6K, 60, etc., or in-body image stabilization. I know my answer is probably leaning towards in-body image stabilization. I'll deal with thermal limits other ways, if they ever are a problem, but I'd be interested to hear what y'all have to say about that. So let's jump to, I have two things basically left to cover. So talking about body and ergonomics, and I'm going to start with talking about the new COM shoe. Real brief, Canon made a big deal about the fact that the COM shoe was going to allow things to communicate with the camera. All I have to say is whether or not this is a killer app feature of Canon's cameras going forward is going to depend entirely on what Canon and third parties do with it. So TAC has announced that they're working on a recorder for this new communication shoe. If they're the only person doing it or only company doing it, I'm not sure it's going to be all that relevant. However, if companies like Tentacle Sync, Zoom, Rode, Sennheiser, whatever, start putting out products that work with it, it could be a much bigger feature. And so what I mean by that is, for example, a Tentacle Sync that instead of putting an LTC timecode audio signal on your video, just syncs the actual timecode of the camera. And so you basically have gen lock or sync timecode. It technically wouldn't be gen lock. Synced timecode without having to replace the audio track or deal with the LTC audio track. That would be a big thing. The same thing goes with if you are a journalist or whatever, something like the Rode Wireless Go 2 mic system, where all you have to do is clip your Rode receiver into the hot shoe, and it automatically links digitally with the camera, gets power from the camera, does everything like that straight from the camera, and you don't have to worry about extra wires and charging it and so on and so forth. That would be a huge, a useful feature. Again, even going to like Sennheiser, higher end wireless microphone systems, etc., having where you can just clip a little module into the hot shoe and go. Those would be where this hot shoe really, I think, or communication shoe really think starts to shine, as opposed to, well, there's a couple of Canon microphones and that's it. So going along with the rest of the top of the camera, let's talk about the the user interface of the top of the camera as a whole. So it is definitely a different top plate design than the EOS R5. It is very much reminiscent of the top plate design for the 1DX Mark III, with a little bit of R5 thrown in for good measure. They have dedicated buttons for drive AF, flash exposure compensation, and metering. Pushing the two of those together gives you bracketing control and exposure compensation, which are buttons that aren't on an R5 and they are on a 1DX style camera. I'm personally, having shot with a 1D in the past, felt that the user interface was a step back from the 5D or the 40D that I upgraded to it from. I kind of like the 3 buttons on DSLRs. Now, on the R5, I think having everything in the MFN button and dial function menu is a huge step forward. Of course, you can do that on the 5D Mark IV and the 1DX Mark III. Presumably, since there is an MFN button on the R3, you'll also be able to do that there, and I really think that's going to stay kind of the primary, most accessible or most easy way to change all of these settings, instead of having to jump through, hoops. The exposure compensation button I never actually really understood, given that by default exposure compensation is the quick control dial on the back of the camera anyway, but it is what it is. Additionally, on the top of the camera, looking at the top LCD, it looks like they've done exactly the same as the R5. It looks like it's pretty much essentially the same LCD, the same display, same everything. And quite honestly, I'm not a huge fan. I don't like the LCD on the R5. I would like it a lot more if I could invert it to be white or black text on a white background without turning the backlight on. I find that much easier to read. I find black text on the black text on a white background mode is a lot harder for me to read in a lot of different conditions that I don't know. I don't feel like it should be something that I have to deal with or whatever. Of course, I don't use the top LCD all that much, so in certain respects, I'd almost like a mode where I could just turn it off and it doesn't use any power at all, ever. But it looks like they're doing the same thing. White on black seems to be the new slick LCD look for the top of the cameras. Like I said, I'm not a big fan. The other thing on the top and leading us into the rear of the camera is the viewfinder, and going by the specs, it looks like it's the exact same viewfinder as on the R5. Same eye point, same frame rate, same number of dots, same etc. Obviously, it's going to do eye focus or whatever it is, the eye tracking thing where it sees where you're looking and puts the focus point there. So that's not exactly the same viewfinder, but the general specifications of it should perform about the same or the same as the R5, which, okay, some people are going to make a complaint that it's not like the Alpha 1, and again, and it can't do 240 frames per second. Quite honestly, I don't know if it matters that much. I mean, I know there's some research that's been done for like games that show that 240 frame per second monitors are better than 120 frame per second monitors, even for below, average or entry level gamers. But quite honestly, I'm not sure it makes that much of a difference on the camera. And again, this could be some of my biases because I have my viewfinder set to 60 frames a second because I can't see a difference going to when I go to 120. It doesn't really, like, it's not really helping that much. And between my own reaction times and whatnot, and the shutter lags and whatnot, there's enough of a predictive aspect in like situations where something happens immediately and I'm trying to shoot it that I don't really, I don't know. Like, I can see going to 240 eventually, but you know, the other thing too is power. Shooting through the viewfinder because of the higher frame rates, the higher power densities or whatever, you know, I'm not entirely sure what exactly the situation is, but every mirrorless camera burns more power using the EVF than they do using the rear LCD. And every mirrorless camera that has an option to go to a much higher frame rate mode using the EVF burns even more power still. And power is still a thing on mirrorless cameras. They don't match DSLRs in terms of power. So, you know, it is what it is. Speaking of power, it uses the same batteries as the 1DX Mark III does, the LPE19. Obviously, that delivers more power, higher voltage. It's, you know, the professional Canon battery. I won't get into my frustration with that in terms of having been a 1D and 5D user and having to carry two different kinds of batteries and two different kinds of chargers. But I really would like to see a solution to that from Canon. Whether the easy answer is a new battery grip for the R5 that takes the higher end batteries. Whether it has to have voltage regulators in it or not to step it down to R5 voltage, I don't really care. But let me, if I'm in the situation, and it's entirely reasonable because there is no EOS 1R yet, or R1, that if I'm in the situation of carrying a like a 5D for landscapes and or an R5 for landscapes and an R3 for sports or something like that, let me have a unified battery system. It just, as somebody who's traveled and dealt with two different things, two different batteries, it is so much easier to have a unified battery system, all the same batteries everywhere. So that would be nice, but that's less of an issue with the R3 and more of an issue with the R5, but whatever. The last thing I want to talk about body ergonomics wise is that the camera was returning to having a video still toggle switch on the back. And I'm not clear how this is actually going to work. I expect it's going to work somewhat like the info button when you hit mode on the R5. So on the R5, to switch from stills to video or video to stills, you hit the mode button and then you hit info and it toggles between the two modes. I'm making a bold assumption here that on the R3, it's just going to be flip the switch and mode will do what mode does without hopefully independently. Hopefully they'll keep what the R5 has, where you have custom modes for video and custom modes for stills. But, again, who knows? We'll find out when the manuals are released, I guess. But that certainly is a faster way to flip into video mode than hitting mode and then info and so on and so forth. So not necessarily a bad thing. The bigger question to me will be how they actually implement it, whether they do the complete split that kind of Canon has on the R5, or if it's more of uses the same mode your Canon camera is set to like it does on the 5D Mark IV. I'm not actually sure what the 1DX Mark III does specifically, but as it were. So wrapping this up, I want to talk quickly about the price value proposition. Announced price is $6,000 US. And I don't know. I find that a hard value proposition. Now, they sell 1DX Mark IIIs. There's plenty of professional sports journalists, sports photographers and journalists and so forth that are shooting 1DX Mark IIIs. Those are $7,500 or $6,500. They're less than 2 years old. So obviously people are buying these cameras or this class of camera at this price point because the 1DX is being sold, sells. I feel like this is a pretty steep price for not maybe the best value proposition. Now, a lot of that has to do with me. I said at the beginning, I'm not the target market for this camera. I'm just not. So I am going to end up projecting a little bit. So at $6,000, it's about $500 less than a 1DX Mark III. Okay, that does undercut the 1DX slightly, which I guess, capabilities wise, it looks like it's a better camera than the one. It looks like an upgrade from the 1DX, so I guess that's a good thing. On the same token, it's $2,100 more expensive than an EOS R5 without a battery grip. So in the base configuration, and it's like $1,750 more expensive, or $1,850, whatever, $1,750 to $1,850 more expensive than an R5. Okay, so on the pro side, if you were in the target market, I can definitely see where the value is. Resolution, frame rate, kills it for sports photography. The reality is when you start talking about journalism and sports photography, 50 and 60 megapixel images are not really the needed thing. In fact, in general, in photography, I'm not convinced 50 or 60 megapixel images are especially necessary in many, if not all, circumstances. Anyway, I understand that it's nice to have. I would prefer to have had more than 24 megapixels, like 30 megapixels. I think the R3 would have been a pretty solid camera across the board. But I can also sort of see the situation of not wanting to go through the roof. Bigger images mean bigger files. When you're shooting at high frame rates, that's more files still. That takes more time to process on a computer, whether you're talking JPEGs or RAWs, whatever. There's an efficiency thing to be had by targeting a resolution that works for the target market and not just going overboard. And there's an efficiency to be had for not shooting, say, forcing a good portion of your potential users to shoot some downsampled mode. So if, for example, I've had it from very credible people that at least one, if not more, of Europe's wire services and press agencies won't take images that have more than 6,000 pixels on a long edge. They want something smaller, or they want 6K pixels on the long edge. So it works out to be 24 megapixels. The exact resolution, actually, that the EOS R3 is. And there's something to be said about efficiency of having a camera spit that out as the default, as opposed to having a camera spit out a 60 megapixel image that has to be downsampled either in camera or after the fact or whatever and processed into what you need to deliver. And as far as I know, for most of the wire services that are, like, for example, here in the US, I don't know if they have specific image resolution limits, but I'm not seeing anybody that I've talked to that has specifically said that they want super high resolution images either. In most cases, the people that I know have worked for wire services were delivering like 10 to 20 megapixel images, and that was pretty much on par with what their employers wanted. And again, when you get to the other side of the equation, 24 megapixel image will make a good print. It's not like we're talking about, well, this isn't capable of producing the same quality print as a film camera could and blah, blah, blah. So you can make a good print from this. What is the image being used for if you're talking about the camera in a photojournalism or journalistic sense? Well, newspapers, and they're dying, don't need tons of resolution. They're limited hugely by what they can print, and the printers are just not that good. and the paper is not that good. Online media, which is where most people are going for images, well, straight up, most desktop displays, let's just assume most desktop displays are 4K. That means there's a total of about 8.5 megapixels of resolution available in the display. Now, most media outlets don't give you images big enough to fill the full screen at full resolution. They're not giving you an 8 megapixel image because, well, first of all, they're kind of big. That costs money. Because it uses more bandwidth, and so that costs money, and that's not what press, media, etc. is extremely interested in doing, is spending tons of money to give you a picture of the politician talking about something or stealing candy from a baby or whatever it is. Like the intent of the imagery is to illustrate the story. In the vast majority of cases, is to illustrate the story, not be fine art. And as a consequence of that, it does not need to be a really high resolution image. And of course, that's talking about camera or online delivery. When you start talking about tablets and phones, the stuff gets even smaller. Resolution's even lower. So as I said, I don't find the value proposition pretty good. And I'm going to try and wrap this up quickly because one of my cameras just flipped off and I'm pretty sure my other one's not long for this either. The short of it is, well, for me personally, I don't need 30 frames a second. 20 is more than enough for what I'm shooting. And resolution-wise, one way or another, I'd like more than 24 megapixels. I don't necessarily know if I need 45, but I like 30. That's more than 24. 45 is definitely more than 24. But when push comes to shove, the real problem that I run into is like comparing the R3 to the EOS R5. So the R5's $3,900 just for the camera. Add a battery grip, it's $4,250. So resolution-wise, the R5 has more than 50% more resolution, from 24 megapixels to 45 megapixels. It only has two-thirds of the max frame rate when shooting with the electronic shutter. So 20 frames per second instead of 30 frames a second. How necessary is that extra 30 frames a second? Of course, I can always put the camera in 8K video mode and shoot 30 frames a second there. Okay, I get a little less resolution, but 32 to 35 megapixels is still more than 24 megapixels. It has the exact same frame rates for the mechanical and electronic first curtain shutter. So same straight up. I have one stop less maximum ISO on the R5 compared to the R3, so I can go up to 100,000 expanded, not 200,000 expanded. And okay, there's no COM shoe on the R5, but I'm not convinced that's a killer feature yet. So how is Canon making the case for this? I mean, I know they're going to say weather sealing, and I know they're going to say, well, the stacked sensor makes lower rolling shutter effects and so forth, which, that's true, and there is value to that. I'm not going to deny it. There's also, well, it doesn't have a recording time limit, maybe. There's value in that. But then the question is there $1,800 to $2,100 of value in that compared to an R5? And I'm not convinced that there is. So I think the price point's high. Regardless, I thought I was expecting to see the camera between $5,000 and $5,500. I think that would have been a much more reasonable price point for the camera given the feature set. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's some of these things that are so killer to certain areas of photography that I just don't see the value in them because it's not relevant to me, like the really high shutter speeds. I don't know. But I think there's a much better case that could be made for the camera value being a good value or a better value coming in, say, $1,000 to $500 cheaper. Now, obviously, it'll hopefully maybe it'll get there eventually as time goes on, and Canon lowers the price because that usually happens to these cameras. I don't know. Like I said, I don't think on the plus side, I don't think this is a Nikon D3 D700 situation. There is enough that separates the R3 from both the R5 and R6 in terms of performance and in terms of features and in terms of capabilities that it's not just well, you could get two R6s for the price of one R3. I'm going to just get two R6s. I mean, I know there's going to be some photographers who are going to potentially do that, but I don't think that this is quite the same situation, especially if you step up to the R5, which in my opinion is way better user interface than the R6, that it's not half the price. So you're not getting two R5s for the price of one R3, and it doesn't have 95% of the capabilities. It has a lot of the capabilities, but there's definitely places where for journalism, for sports photography, the R3 is still going to offer stuff that the R5 can't do. The other concern that I have coming out of the pricing situation is that, well, where's the R1 going to get priced? Like if the R5 or R3 is $6,000 and it's $2,000 more than essentially it's essentially $2,000 more than the R5, is the R1 going to be back to an $8,000 camera? I mean, it's entirely reasonable. There was a time when the 1DS was an $8,000 camera. That's going to be, given the capabilities that we're seeing in the R5, for the R1 to be literally twice as expensive, it's going to have to be a heck of a camera. And I'm not sure how that's going to play out either. I'm not even sure that they can make a heck of a camera that's that heck of a much better camera. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up here. If you made it this far, thanks a lot for watching. Please consider subscribing. I have got stuff on the R5 coming out weekly. I'm currently working on a series about lighting technology that's going to evolve into talking about lighting, how to light things, etc. I don't know if I'm the right person to talk about that, but I'm going to. It's a brain dump on what I understand about lighting, so it might be useful. I'm also currently working on a project looking at compression ratios and image or video quality, comparing ProRes, AVC, HEVC, interframe, etc. All of the kinds of crazy stuff that maybe isn't so relevant if your budget is big enough that you can have 100 terabyte storage server for your video shooting. But if you're like me and 16 terabytes is kind of expensive to actually build and maintain, you're trying to get the most bang from your buck video wise, that might also be interesting. So if this sounds interesting to you, please consider smashing that subscribe button. If this was interesting, please consider smashing that like button. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.